He's in Nashville, and I talked to him yesterday.
Yeah, I just did a meeting.
He's at like a
Yeah.
conference or something.
Yeah. Commissioner Bowser? Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes.
Ms. Carroll? Are we ready? Everyone ready? Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Mayor Pro Tem Clark, my fellow commissioners, Clerk Canton, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's business meeting. Today is Wednesday, October 23rd, 2019. It is now 9 a.m. I will call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, would you please call roll?
Honorable Senator Whitehead.
Here.
Honorable Kathy Clark.
Here.
Honorable Ralph Heschler.
Present.
Honorable Paul Baca.
Here.
Honorable George Spaghetti.
Here.
Madam Mayor, we have a quorum.
Thank you. At this time, the second item on our agenda is silent meditation. I would like to ask everyone to please join me in 15 seconds of silent meditation, please. Thank you. The next item on our agenda this morning is item B3, Pledge of Allegiance. Ms. Carroll, would you please lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda this morning is item B4, approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda for October 23rd, 2019, as submitted?
So moved, Mayor Whitehead.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to approve the agenda as submitted. Is there any further questions, comments, concerns? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. The next item on our agenda this morning is item C. We have two presentations. C1 is a presentation of a proclamation naming November 10th as American Legion Women's Auxiliary Centennial Day. Do I see anybody here from the auxiliary? I do not. So then we will move on to, we'll put that on hold because they are supposed to be here. So we will move on to our next item on the agenda is item C2, presentations. The presentation is related to small business, families, and rural communities, access to affordable energy. We have Matthew Gonzalez this morning, Consumer Energy Alliance. Before we get started, Mr. Gonzalez, we usually allow 10 minutes for our presentations, but as you've driven from Cimarron this morning to give this presentation, we will allow you 20 minutes.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate that. It was a nice long haul, and so it'll be worth the 20 minutes. Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy coming to other city commission meetings and seeing how they're run. I'm a city council member up in the village of Cimarron, so it always interests me to see how other village governments work. So let me go and jump into the presentation. I've got 20 minutes. I've got about 40 slides. Fortunately, I am Hispanic, so I can speak very fast. And so I'll try to run through this as quickly as possible, and then hopefully we'll have some questions at the end. Let me see. Is this working? Which turn on here? It is not.
Go ahead, just tell me when you're ready.
Okay, next slide. So just quickly, a little bit about me. As was mentioned, I'm Matthew Gonzalez. I am from Cimarron, New Mexico. And we have, my wife and I, Victoria, have two daughters, Aspen and Eva. So I always like to tell people we have skin in the game. It's important for us to see New Mexico continue to thrive and do well because we're raising two daughters here, and we want them to have opportunities. We have this issue of the brain drain taking place, and so Victoria and I are very committed to being involved in public policy and helping create opportunities for all of our children. I'm an Air Force veteran. I had the opportunity to serve in the Air Force right after 9/11. 9/11 happened. I was a senior in high school, and I knew that was my calling. And so I spent 6 years in the Air Force, came back to New Mexico, and I got engaged in public policy. I've been doing that now for the past 10 years. I've had the opportunity to work with the State Chamber of Commerce. I've worked in the oil and gas industry, helping educate consumers on where that energy comes from. And then my last stint was with the New Mexico Farm and Livestock Bureau. I was their agriculture lobbyist. I lobbied in Santa Fe and in Washington on agriculture issues facing farmers and ranchers all across the state of New Mexico. I'm also an elected official. I throw that out there because I have many of the same pains y'all have as a small government. And so when it comes to understanding the struggles that you face, I get it because I live it every single day. Next slide. So as far as my presentation goes, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Consumer Energy Alliance is. I'll give you guys a U.S. and New Mexico energy snapshot. We'll talk about where energy comes from and where potential future development exists. Talk about why affordable energy matters, and I'll give you some ways on how you can get involved or how your community can get involved. Next slide. So first about CEA. We were founded in 2006. And the idea was simple. We wanted to make sure that we were focusing on improving the public's understanding of energy. Most citizens don't understand really where their energy comes from. We've become so blessed in some ways that when we go home at the end of the day, we hit the light switch, the light comes on, we don't think twice about it. I've had the opportunity to travel around the world during my time in the military, and there were some hotels in some of these countries that we went to that you'd hit the light and the whole building would flicker. And it's something that we sometimes take for granted. So I really enjoy educating people about energy. I think that there's a lot of misinformation out there. I don't have an opinion really either way. I just want people to know the facts. And so that's what we try to do at CEA. We're very good at telling stories and helping people understand energy and how it exists in our economy. Go back real quick. We've got about 280 affiliate members, and I want to point that out because we're not just energy companies. We actually have the majority of our membership are actually a cross-section of the American economy. So like on our board of directors, we have Caterpillar, Nucor Steel, Wortham Insurance, airlines, you name it. We are looking at everyone. In New Mexico, on our board specifically, is the New Mexico Trucking Association. These are all energy users. Energy is one of those topics that everybody uses it. It doesn't matter if you're filling up your car, you're turning on the light switch, or you're running propane or natural gas to your home. We all see energy in some way, shape, or fashion. So it really is a topic that relates to everybody. Let's go to the next slide. So our focus is simple. We focus on families because those are the people who ultimately have to pay the cost at the end of the day. Your constituents every single month have energy bills. If we don't have good, sensible policy coming out of Santa Fe, we could see those energy costs rise. The organization Voices for Children released a study a couple of years back, and they found that nearly 40% of our children being raised in New Mexico are being raised in poverty. These children are growing up in families where mom and dad or dad or grandma are having to make tough decisions every single day. They're having to decide whether they're going to pay that electric bill or they're going to put food on the table because it's hard to make ends meet. And I want people to remember that. I grew up as a poor kid in northeast New Mexico. I know what it's like to go to bed hungry. It's hard to fathom sometimes if you don't know those people. But the reality is they exist, and nearly every other child in New Mexico is in that situation. So it's important that we always keep that in mind as policymakers when we're making decisions, because those families are the ones who are most at risk. We're a nonpartisan organization. We speak to Republicans, we speak to Democrats, we speak to independents. It doesn't matter what your party affiliation is. When it comes to energy, it should not be a partisan issue. Unfortunately, it oftentimes becomes that way. When I'm talking to Republicans, I'm reminding them the importance of renewable energy and what that looks like going forward, how we need to invest in things like transmission lines so that as renewable energy comes online, we've got a place to put that energy so that we're not just losing it. When I'm talking to Democrats, I'm reminding them the importance of oil and gas and what that does for our state budget. Right now, nearly 1/3 of our entire budget is funded by the oil and gas industry. We're very blessed to have that industry here in New Mexico because it provides so many opportunities. So when we talk about 1/3, we're talking about 1/3 of teachers, 1/3 of public servants, you name it. If it's cops, if you can think of 1/3 of your public employees that you can do away with, then we can probably do away with the oil and gas industry. My contention is we can't afford to do away with any of them. We're environmental protection. We believe in protecting the environment. But we believe in solutions. I see a lot of activism that I feel is misguided. Oftentimes they're saying we don't want to see new development, or we don't want to see any of this. And the problem with that is that there's not ever conversation on how does it work best for a community. I don't want to see the environment wrecked. Like I said, I've got 2 daughters in the school system. I want to see them have opportunities going forward. But if we don't have honest conversations and come up with real policy that helps our constituents, then what are we even doing as elected officials? So oftentimes as local electeds, we get it because we have to see our constituents every day. Sometimes in Santa Fe they can get a little bit squirrely because they don't see us as often. They can sometimes make decisions and they think it's happening in a vacuum when in reality it has impacts all around the state. And then the last part is energy solutions. We want to make sure that people are having, like I said, real serious dialogue about this. This idea that we're going to leave oil and gas in the ground isn't going to happen. In fact, a lot of the people that say let's leave oil and gas in the ground are tweeting that from their plastic cell phones, using energy at a rapid rate. They're driving to protests wanting to say leave it in the ground, not realizing that those roads they drive on are made of oil and gas. That new car, that new Tesla that they just bought, those tires come from oil and gas. The plastic inside, the safety equipment that you put on your kids when they ride their bike, it's an oil and gas byproduct. So we have to be realistic about it, because oil and gas is not just the fuel in your car. It's not just the natural gas that you turn on your stove. It has so many other applications. Next slide. So I'm going to run real quickly through the energy types, just because I always like to touch on this and make sure people are aware of what we have out there, and also what the potential is here in New Mexico. So first, we have wind, solar, oil, nuclear, coal, natural gas. Next slide. Hydro, geothermal, ethanol, which is a form of biomass, and then I have wood, algae, and then I also have dung on there. And I always like giving this presentation to elementary school kids, because the ones who know what dung is start to snicker and they laugh a little bit. But I put this up here because it's a really serious slide. So many New Mexicans today rely on wood, or that form of biomass, as a way to warm their homes. When you look at the bigger picture in the world, nearly 2 billion people, I want to say it's more than 2 billion people, are right now using wood or dung as their primary source of energy. They're not hitting a light switch when they get home. They're literally going out in the field, gathering dung or gathering wood, going home, lighting fires, warming their food, warming their homes, and that's the extent of their energy. So we have to remember that while we are so accustomed to hitting that light switch, for some people, it's not as simple. Next slide. This is a great slide that I always love to use because I think it really puts things into perspective. This lists out all those energy types again, but this is done by Lawrence Livermore Laboratories. Lawrence Livermore is very similar to like Los Alamos National Labs or Sandia, but what they do every year is they create a chart that is estimated energy use, energy consumption in quadrillion BTUs. So the United States as a whole uses about 101 quadrillion BTUs, and that was in 2018. Now, if you look on those slides on the left, the squares on the left, it has all the different types. Now, what's important is not the size of the square. What's important is the size of the line coming out of it. So if you'll click it one more time, Renee, it's going to put up some numbers. Right now, currently today, solar accounts for less than 1% of all the energy that we use in the United States. Now, when you watch TV, you would assume solar is probably the biggest energy producer out there because you hear so much about it. You hear so much about wind energy. And while those are important, the reality of it is they're not anywhere close to meeting all of our energy needs. So this idea that we can just leave oil and gas in the ground and transition tomorrow is not realistic. It's not practical. So we have to make sure that as we do that, as we see transition to things like renewable energy, that it's done in such a way that is not going to hammer your poor citizens. Next slide. This is from the Energy Information Administration, so this comes from our own federal government. They do predictions every year based on policies that are out there, based on policies coming down the pipe, availability of the different natural resources. Our own Energy Information Administration, and this was the case even through the Obama years, has predicted that our energy consumption is going to remain relatively the same. Natural gas is actually expected to go up. Coal kind of tapers off. You're not seeing a lot of coal use anymore in the United States, but there are still a lot of emerging economies like China and India that are using coal. So there's opportunities for places like New Mexico where we have these coal reserves that we could be sending them overseas to other countries that are coming along. So we always got to be looking at that. This is just a quick map that shows you where energy opportunities exist. Anytime you look at a study done talking about economic development opportunities for a community, they always cite things like energy, because energy is truly economic-based jobs. When you can have that and you can transport that energy outside of, you send that energy outside of your area, it brings in money. So that's always important. We have tons of energy potential here in New Mexico. Unfortunately, we've never truly tapped into it. We've done it here at times. Oil and gas is the big one that has really taken off. But when you talk about opportunities for solar and wind, we've got so much sunlight and so much wind that literally we should be looking at all of those future opportunities. Next slide. And then just real quick, I'm going to run through the energy sources, pros and cons, and then talk about the potential for development. So next slide. So first, solar. Solar is a big one, like I mentioned earlier. It doesn't play as big of a part as many people would like, but solar is going to continue to come along. The good news, though, is that we have the opportunity to produce a lot of these solar panels in the United States. The only problem we really run into is the rare earth minerals that go into making these solar panels. More than 90% of them are owned by China. So the issue you run into is if you're going to have solar panels, you're going to have to do business with China in order to get those rare earth minerals. Now, Mike, the only issue I have with that is China, they're not the best stewards of the land. They don't do a good job when it comes to environmental protections. So that always makes me a little bit nervous. So anytime I'm talking with people and they're saying, well, I'm going to buy solar panels, what should I be looking at? I always encourage them, well, first, look at those companies that are producing them here in America, because there's a little bit more environmental protection involved, and it ensures that whatever's going into that there's actually some people watching and paying attention. Whereas in China, places like China, they literally can dump old used water into streams, and it contaminates things, and so it's not good for the environment. And that's the biggest issue we have. We can clean our backyard all day long, but if China continues to pollute, what difference is it really going to make? And so we got to make sure we're balancing that. Next slide. At a glance, I won't go through the slide, but this just talks about the solar opportunities here in the state of New Mexico. And I'll just leave that up for a second so you can take a look at it. Next slide. Wind, lots of opportunities for wind. The great thing about wind is that there are no emissions. But I will tell you that it doesn't matter the energy source, there's always going to be the tailpipe. And I say tailpipe because every fuel source has a tailpipe. It doesn't matter if it's a car, you have a tailpipe putting out those emissions. If you're building wind turbines, you have to mine for things like copper to make those. Well, we have the opportunity to mine for that copper right here in New Mexico, out in Silver City. But if regulations aren't so that they allow for that, or they don't encourage that, we're going to end up buying all of our copper from places like Africa, again, where there are no environmental protections, and it ends up just putting the environment more at risk. So we've got to make sure that we're having real conversations, making sure that mines like the Freeport-McMoran Chino mine are staying in business, but that the community is working with organizations like the mine and local elected officials to make sure that there's balance there so that we're still protecting the environment while creating economic opportunity. Next slide. These are some of the wind projects in the state, and I'll go ahead and we'll just keep going through. I don't want to kill you with PowerPoint. We've got a lot of slides. Petroleum, that's a big one here in the state of New Mexico. The Permian Basin is considered the most prolific play in the entire world. They're expecting hundreds of years of production ahead of us in that particular development. Technologies have come along so that we're actually able to. Back in the day, you would just drill a hole and you'd fracture it, and then oil would flow to the surface. And you go down 100 feet, you poke another hole in the ground, you drill down, fracture the rock, and then oil would flow to the surface. Now we actually have the ability within the oil and gas industry. There's a new technology developed several years back called horizontal drilling. So they can actually drill down from one pad and drill out several different directions and basically pull all that oil in from the same area that they would have probably put 10 or 15 wells in. So the impact to the environment has been lessened. So again, this industry that's got billions of dollars, they're getting better and better at it every day. American ingenuity, and I really feel like consumers have really pushed this industry to be better stewards of the land. Next slide. And these are some of the locations where we have oil and gas in the state. Predominantly, the Permian Basin has a lot of like I said, has a lot of oil. There is some oil up in the San Juan area, but it does cost a little bit more to recover that oil. So when it becomes more cost effective, I think you'll see more of that happening. I always love to point to this slide too, and it's more related to natural gas. But up in the Raton Basin where I live, we have a lot of natural gas wells. And when I hear from people telling me, I have friends who work for groups like 350.org or Sierra Club, and they tell me, Matt, We can't be drilling for oil and gas because we can't do it safely. It's just going to harm the environment. I remind them that one of the greatest environmentalists out there, his name's Ted Turner. We call him Uncle Ted where I'm from. But Ted Turner's drilled 900 wells up there in the Valle Vidal. 900 wells, and if you're a hunter, you know that the Valle Vidal is a once-in-a-lifetime hunt. It is some of the most pristine land out there. Like when you drive through the Valle Vidal, it's beautiful. You have elk running everywhere. When you drive through there, you won't spot one oil well. Because Ted said, when we're going to drill these wells, one, we're going to make sure that we're environmentally safe, but we're going to make sure that they don't disrupt the natural beauty of the environment that we're in. Let's put these in strategic locations so that people can still come out here, enjoy the great outdoors without having to see something like a pump jack going up and down. And I'm telling you, 900 wells in that area. I go up there every single summer. I know where some of the wells are, but to the average everyday citizen, they couldn't spot them if you paid them $100. Next slide. Nuclear. Now, New Mexico has tons of potential for nuclear. Unfortunately, this industry didn't get off to the right foot in New Mexico, and so for a long time there were a lot of environmental protections that were not in place, and we've seen things like contamination happen in the Grants area. What I will point out, though, is that according to scientists, roughly 88% of all of the contamination that is in the Grants area is actually naturally occurring. So it exists that way. So when you hear people talking about all the contamination, a lot of that is naturally occurring. That's the same for any kind of geologic formation. You hear about methane issues. In the Four Corners area, they have lots of methane that naturally seeps up, or what they call a natural outcropping. This already exists. Now, we have to make sure that when we're developing this kind of stuff, that those companies, again, are being good stewards on the land. But nuclear really has the potential to take off. And again, no CO2 emissions. If we really want to go green at some point and we want to get away from CO2 emissions, this, in my opinion, is our best bet. But again, we've got to make sure we're protecting the environment, make sure we're protecting water and communities. Next slide. This is some of the nuclear potential within the state of New Mexico, and there's some great facts up there on it, but it talks about, what a lot of people don't realize is that Grants is actually the 7th largest uranium producer in the world, just the Grants area. And we are not producing uranium from there anymore. And it's still number 7 in the world just with the production that has happened. There's a lot of interest in bringing uranium mining back. There's a lot of companies that have leases in that area. And I think that if they can ever get the regulatory structure right and something that works for that community along for the state, I think we can see more jobs and more opportunities for that community. And Grants in that area right now really is economically depressed. And so they need these kind of opportunities. Next slide. Coal. We've got an abundant supply of coal. We know that in the United States we've got over 500 years worth of coal reserves. Unfortunately, it's a dirty burning fuel. So you're seeing more and more, you saw a lot more emphasis on things like clean coal, clean facilities that would actually, scrub it so that you're not putting all this harmful chemicals into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, government has decided to move away from that, and really public opinion has swayed that so much that coal is kind of going away. Unfortunately, for companies, so I'll give you an example, the Navajo Nation actually owns several coal mines, and they're nervous because they've got this natural resource that they own, but now it's like, well, what markets are they going to sell it to? And these are truly coal jobs for Native Americans who live in, really, the Navajo Nation is one of the most economically depressed areas in the entire country. So now they're trying to find new ways to create jobs. And so it's, again, a matter of, it's a balancing act. The other thing I'll point out is that there are a lot of Navajos within the Navajo Nation right now that will actually go, because there's natural outcroppings of coal, they'll take coal and they'll actually burn them in their homes. They'll take a lump of coal and they'll burn it in their home to heat it. So I was talking about dung and wood earlier. For many Navajos, it's actually a lump of coal that they are burning to keep their homes warm. So when we think about energy, it's easy to be real high and mighty about, oh, well, I want only solar on my roof. There are a lot of people that don't have the same opportunities that we all do. Coal production, this kind of just lays it out again, talks about the economic benefit, 4.65 billion tons, or about 1% of the national reserves. Next slide. Natural gas. We've got a lot of natural gas. This used to be a big boom for New Mexico back in the day. At one time, natural gas was right at $9 an MCF. That has since dropped to around $2.50. Anytime that price changes on natural gas by just 10 cents over an entire fiscal year, so if it was at $2.50 and next year it goes up to $2.60, when it changes by just 10 cents, that's a $10 million hit to our budget, either plus or minus. So if it's 10 cents higher, $10 million more to our budget. With oil and gas, anytime the price changes by $1 on a barrel of oil over a year, that price is a $7 million hit to our budget. So oil and gas still play a very huge part in our budget cycle. Next. And this just talks about the energy savings thanks to natural gas. for consumers. Natural gas is one of the cleanest burning fuels that are out there when you're talking about burning stuff. There are more opportunities to it. The cool thing about natural gas is when you're drilling for it, because it's clean, you can literally put it into a pipeline and pump it right into a home. So there's not as much need for infrastructure to send it to other places. We will, if we have a surplus of it, it makes sense to have that in place so that you can sell it out of state. But the good news is that if New Mexicans wanted to use that, you have the ability to put that right into homes right out of the ground. Next slide. Hydroelectric, this is a form of energy you see in a lot of other states. New Mexico's got a little bit of it, but you don't see it as much of it anymore. Dams are so expensive to build nowadays that you just don't see anyone building dams anymore. So hydroelectric really hasn't done as much as it probably still could. There's a lot of hydroelectric, and you have the Hoover Dam, you've got some of these places that produce a ton of energy. In New Mexico, next slide. We've got a little bit of production. Of course, Elephant Butte has some production. You have some up in the Four Corners area, and then Abiquiu actually has some hydroelectric production as well. Abiquiu and El Vado. So 5 locations in the state, not a lot of it. We don't have as much water. We tend to be pretty dry around here, so we don't have as much hydropower as some other states. Next slide. But again, the potential's there. Now, geothermal is one I love to talk about, and I'm actually going to have you go skip to the next slide immediately. The red part of the map is literally all the places in New Mexico where we have geothermal potential. All of our pueblos and tribes actually have the potential to produce geothermal energy. Now, again, this is something that's going to take build-out. It's going to take infrastructure to do all of this, and it's going to take a regulatory environment that's going to promote that. So, again, more opportunities. New Mexico truly is blessed with lots of opportunities. We just have to capitalize on them. Next slide. And then biomass, and I won't get into too much about it, but biomass has its pros and cons. The one thing I will say is now, the U.S. Congress has now made hemp federally legal. So we will see a lot more hemp production within the state of New Mexico. When they were getting ready to set up the program, they assumed that there was going to be probably about 80 applications for licenses. When they finished, they had over 400. On top of that, 100 of them are going to actually be for year-round, so it's going to be indoor grow labs, so you're talking greenhouses. The benefit to New Mexico is that can be turned into ethanol as well, so biofuel, and you could end up seeing some of that production happening here in New Mexico. Now, I always throw corn up here because we always hear of the Iowa caucus every 4 years when there's a presidential cycle. I think the biggest reason that ethanol is still such a big player in the bigger picture is because of that Iowa caucus, because every president has to pander to ethanol. And really, ethanol is not the best stuff out there. It's not the best on your engines. The other part is there are some instances there for a long time, it was taking 1.5 gallons of gas to produce 1 gallon of ethanol. So it didn't seem to make a lot of sense, but it made people feel good. More than 50% of the corn that is actually produced in places like Iowa is actually used towards ethanol and not feeding people. So I would like to see more of it going towards feeding people, but that's the reality of the economy right now. So next slide. This is our energy consumption here in New Mexico. You can see that a large amount of it comes from coal. We have a lot from natural gas. I think it's the third tab down, other renewables. That's our renewable energy use here in the state of New Mexico. We are talking about, this transition and moving towards that. Part of it, though, is, again, we use so much energy here in the state that comes from fossil fuels that we're a long way from having renewables meet that entire need. Next slide. And then this breaks down our actual energy mix in New Mexico. So 14% of our energy is produced by renewables. 56% of it right now is produced by coal. And these are numbers from 2012 to 2016. Now, those numbers are going to change over the next few years because we adopted something in New Mexico called the Energy Transition Act. Now, I'll leave it up to you to decide how you feel about the Energy Transition Act. Next slide. But I want to point out a few things, okay? So the ETA sets up a statewide renewable standard that by 2030, New Mexico will be producing more than at least 50% of its energy will be coming from renewable energy by 2030. So we've got 10 years. But by 2045, the goal is to be 100% renewable. Now, I put this out there because I feel like it's very, what's the word I'm looking for? I feel like people have the right mindset. They're wanting to do the right thing, but I don't think it's practical. This is Nat's opinion. With so much of our energy coming from other sources besides renewables right now, this is going to get incredibly costly. So next slide. And when I say incredibly costly, California has already done this. California pushed their renewable energy standards up, and they're trying to get by 2020. They're trying to see I'm sorry, they're trying to get to a point where they're 100% renewable as well. The issue they're running into, though, is they're producing so much of it that they actually, people are paying more in California for energy, yet they're producing more of this of this renewable energy than anywhere else. And they're now having to try to find markets to sell it on. So at some point, when New Mexico starts to transition towards that, if our energy companies can't find the energy here in New Mexico or produce it here, they're going to have to buy it from places like California where they have excess. And it's going to come at a premium because they're already charging more. And I put this next slide up. This is the average price of electricity by the end user. If you look, Texas right now is right at, I think, 8%. $8 per kilowatt hour. New Mexico's right at $9 per kilowatt hour. And then you look at California, they're like at 18 or I think it's 18 cents. Yeah, 18 cents. So they are literally 10 cents higher per kilowatt hour than New Mexico. This ETA, in my opinion, is going to have some of these same effects here in New Mexico if we try to ramp it up too fast. So this is part of what CEA does, is we're trying to educate people on this, because what we probably need to be thinking about, if this doesn't start to work out, is we're going to need to roll some of this back. Otherwise, we're going to really hit consumers hard. Next slide. Affordable energy burden. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of poor people in New Mexico. So when you look at the national average, about 6% of your annual income should be going towards your energy costs. But in New Mexico, because we have such a disproportionate amount of people who live in poverty or people who are poor, they end up paying a higher percentage of their utility, a higher percentage of their annual income is going towards utilities. In some instances, as high as 20 to even 30%. So again, there are families out there right now that it doesn't matter what the price at the gas pump is. If it goes up 5 cents, they're not going to be able to afford $5 more at the pump or $5 more on their electric bill. It doesn't matter how bad we want them to or how good it makes us feel to tell them that this is better for them. They can't afford it, and we've got to keep this in mind. Oil and gas, so I want to put this up there. Oil and gas, again, is the big driver here in the state of New Mexico. Of our $7 billion budget, roughly 1/3 of it comes from the oil and gas industry. That money, so there are a lot of smart people when they started the state back in 1912, and they figured out that we have this finite resource of oil and gas, and what we need to do is make sure that it's going into a fund that all generations can benefit from, because every New Mexican should have an opportunity to benefit from this resource. That fund right now sits at $15 billion. It is the largest permanent fund in the country, with the exception of the one that is owned by the trustees of Harvard. They're the only ones with a bigger permanent fund. When you look at our severance tax permanent fund, that you can go to the next slide. The severance tax permanent fund itself right now sits at $5 billion. Roughly 97% of what is in that was funded by the oil and gas industry. So literally any project you can think of in the state, when you fill out your ICIP priorities and the legislature allocates money, that money's coming directly from the oil and gas industry, essentially. The good news is that while energy use is on the rise, our air pollution, our CO2 emissions is on the decline, and we have continued to see decline. The good news is, when I was growing up back in the 90s, there was this guy named Captain Planet, and Captain Planet came along and he said, you know what, we need everybody doing the right thing. We need to make sure you're not using aerosols, because it's creating this hole in the ozone layer. And so environmental activism really came to be, and I think they had a great impact on kids, because I grew up being more responsible, making sure I wasn't littering, making sure I was trying to recycle when I could. My wife and I, we don't have a recycling program in Cimarron, but we recycle our stuff and we drive it where we need to get it recycled. So I think it's created this awareness. But it's important to realize that as we see that decline, that we're doing the right thing. Now, these are victories you don't always hear about, though. Just a prime example. The United States didn't sign the Paris Accords that were, to deal with climate change. But had we signed the Paris Accords, we'd be 66% of the way to meeting the Paris Accords. The only country that is further along to meeting the Paris Accords is Switzerland, and they roughly are at 72% of the way there. Now, keep in mind, Switzerland has about the same size population as New Mexico. So if New Mexico was all on its own, we'd probably be 66% of the way there, too. So it's always, I always think that's important, because you're talking about a country with 2 million people, and then you're looking at the United States with hundreds of millions of people, and we are continuing to see that decline. We're continuing to meet these goals, even though they were something we didn't sign on to. Global energy demand sees its biggest increase this decade, with gas with gas as the fuel of choice. So as you can see, the United States is the leader when it comes to reduction in CO2 emissions. When you actually look at increases, China and India are way up there. China and India both have over 1 billion people in population. They're emerging economies. You literally have people utilizing every form of energy they can because they want to live the same quality of life that even our poorest citizens have. And we take that for granted sometimes. Next slide. UN estimates that by 2030, there are still going to be roughly 1 billion people, 800 million, almost 1 billion people that won't have access to electricity. And there's still 2.4 billion people using traditional biomass, wood, sticks, dung. Next slide. And these are just some key factors that I always love to throw in there. Without energy, we cannot live the lives we live today. You're talking about manufactured goods. My daughters, they're very green. I like to say that they're very green. They always want to recycle. They always want to do the right thing. They want to leave oil and gas in the ground. And I reminded them this year, they said, Dad, we got to stop using oil and gas. Well, then when my daughter had a soccer game, I said, well, we're going to have to walk to your game because we're not going to use oil and gas anymore. And she started thinking about it. She's like, well, wait a minute. Why, Dad? Why can't we just drive like we have a fuel-efficient car? And I reminded her that if we're going to hold that standard and we expect everyone to live up to it, we should set the example. And that's what I tell the environmental community. As I meet with my friends in the environmental community who I love, I tell them, guys, it's okay to have these beliefs, but you have to make sure that you're living up to the standard and setting the example. Next slide. And we're on the end. We're on the down. So if you're interested in finding out more about the Consumer Energy Alliance and the work that we're doing here in the state of New Mexico, you can visit our website at consumerenergyalliance.org. And we've got tons of information on there that relates to New Mexico. We actually fall under what we call CEA Rockies. And so we put tons of information on. We do op-eds. And again, our focus is just to educate consumers and more so educate people like your constituents on the issues that are really facing them. Santa Fe continues to, in my opinion, overreach on some instances, and I think it's important that our rural communities make sure that they have a voice. Because it might work for Santa Fe or it might work for Albuquerque, when you have a town of 5,000 people or like Cimarron with 1,000 people, if you kill off 10 jobs or 20 jobs or 100 jobs, it can devastate and literally shut down an entire community. Y'all get it. I'm preaching to the choir on this, but that's our focus, is to make sure that people in Santa Fe are thinking about our rural areas. These places where families are have deep roots. Let's make sure that we're not putting them out of business or making them move out of state. Next slide. Just want to thank you for your time. I know I tried to run through that rather quickly. I had 20 minutes. I typically do that presentation over about a 2-hour span. So hopefully you were able to kind of capture it all. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Are there any questions from the commission?
I have a couple comments. Yeah, if you spoke Spanish, would you be faster than you were in English?
A little bit faster. And actually, my wife does a really good job of this presentation in Spanish. She's better than me.
So we did an analysis of the city a few years ago when we were looking at energy costs. Mm-hmm. And what we found was that WAPA, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, is the least expensive source of electric power for us. Mm-hmm. And the most expensive for us is solar. Okay. Which I think is kind of should be reversed, but that's just the way it is. Mm-hmm. But I do have, just from my background, I spent a lot of time living in the mountains where I was lucky to have a candle. Yeah. And I think that we get accustomed to this kind of stuff and this kind of stuff, and that maybe a lot of the part is to educate not only where our power comes from, because I have lived right next to San Onofre and I lived right next to Diablo, and they are both on fault lines, which is not a good place for a nuclear power plant to be. Yep. But maybe part of what goes on with a consortium of trying to deal with energy is teaching people how to use less. Yep. So that the demand goes down. And I didn't hear anything about that in your presentation. Could you just give me a little thought, what your thought is? I mean, you've definitely done an awful lot of study and work on this, and it's impressive. Yes, ma'am. That is definitely a part of it. So we actually have handouts and things like that talk about where you can do more energy efficiency. Things like changing out your light bulbs to LED bulbs. So we have some of that as well that we can talk about.
I didn't include it in this just because I didn't know if I'd even have time to get to it. But I think that's got to be the part of it that everyone has to understand, is that it's not just going to be one solution. It's going to be a number of things that we have to do. It's going to be a matter of being smarter with the amount of energy that we're using, trying to reduce that. California has actually done a really good job of it, and that's literally why they have all of this surplus green energy, is because they've done such a good job of trying to conserve energy that now they've got excess. And so, now it's created other problems for them. So, you know, I think we can learn from those mistakes that they made. I think that as people are starting to conserve and we're bringing stuff online, we need to make sure that we do it in a balanced approach so that we don't see kind of you get the same vacuum effect where now you're paying these higher costs for your energy, but you're not seeing it really any benefit other than we've got excess and now we're trying to sell it somewhere else. So I think that's an important portion of it. But again, it's going to be a multi-step approach, and that's just one portion. The other part is, again, good regulatory structure that promotes, you know, like I'll give you an example. Our governor's talking about increasing the standards on fuel efficiency. Those are the kind of things that we have to take a look at. She's mentioned going as high as 50 miles per gallon. I don't know if that's the answer. I have some concerns on that because I think what that'll do is price out some of our car dealers in the state of New Mexico. I live in a border area. I'll just drive to Colorado and buy a car that, you know, that I can afford rather than waiting to try to buy that other car at 50 miles per gallon. So that concerns me, particularly for our low-income families that are out there, because again, if they can't afford $5 on their gas bill, they certainly can't afford $5 more, or, you know, afford a $10,000. Even if it's a Tesla, they can't afford a $10,000 Tesla. So I think it's going to be several things that we have to do in conjunction in order to really kind of fix this issue. Energy consumption's, less energy use is a big part of it. But I think in New Mexico, what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of people already use less because a lot of people don't want to, because they're already poor. So they're already not turning on the light switches when they get home. I'll give you a great example. My grandfather only burns wood in the house during the day during the winter time. He opens up his windows. He doesn't use any lights because that's what he can afford because he lives on a fixed income. So I think there are a lot of families that, I mean, I guess if you have the ability to use a lot of energy, you need to be thinking about trying to conserve. There are a lot of families that are already conserving. A large majority of our families already conserve because they don't have a choice. So it's got to be part of the conversation, though. It's a big part of the conversation.
Yeah, using less. And the other comment I have is I lived in California for many years.
Mm-hmm.
PG&E is a stock held company.
Yes, ma'am.
So they have the highest kilowatt per hour, and they burned up my brother-in-law's house.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
the concept is there are a lot of energy companies that are dealing with the stock and not dealing with the consideration
I would agree.
of what they're doing. And has there been any motion towards realizing that just putting money in your pocket is not the end game?
Yes.
That there are other things. There's too many of us on this planet, and we're destroying it very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it doesn't matter if you got a couple $1,000,000 in the bank.
Yep.
You know, you're not going to be able to buy that Tesla and be able to plug it
That's
in
right.
at some point.
That's right.
Have you heard anything on that?
So a little bit on the California front, you're right. So the big issue that they're having now is because I think there's essentially 3 big utilities in the state of California at this point. PG&E have filed for bankruptcy, and that concerns a lot of people because they're talking about they're having to upgrade infrastructure. And now that they've filed for bankruptcy, you literally have people who are worried because they've got areas where there's high wind, and you have infrastructure that's 100 years old at this point. You know, some lines some poles that are 100 years old, and when that wind blows, it ends up knocking them down, creates fires, and and now with the drought they're having in California, it's creating all these wildfires. So we've got to do our best, I think, to try to avoid that. The other concern, though, and I think to your point, is we have a big utility like that in New Mexico. PNM's a big one. And again, this is, you know, just looking at what has happened. I'm not making a determination on PNM because I have a lot of friends at PNM. But the issue, I think, with PNM is like now with the way the ETA was developed, they did all of this retrofitting to the San Juan Generating Station to help clean up the coal production that was taking place there. The energy production was coming from coal. And then literally, here we are a few years later, and now they want to shut it in. And part of that ETA proposal was they'd get to shut it in, but they're going to get cost recovery on top of it, plus 10%. So to your point about, you know, the company making all the money in, at the end of the day, does it make the environment any safer? Probably not. They're gonna, I mean, if I was in the business of P&M at this point, I would just continue to build stuff if ratepayers are gonna have to pay me back whatever it costs in 10% on top of that. And that's the hard part, is that you're right. They're not balancing what is good for the environment, what is good for the public, along with what's good for their shareholders. And so it's just, I wish I had the answer for you on that. If I did, I'd be rich right now, and
You'd have the millions.
right, I'd have millions of dollars. And so I don't know what the answer is on that. And I don't know that anybody does. Because, you know, those companies, constitutionally, they got to look out for their rate, or for their investors, for their stockholders. And that's the really, really hard part about it. It's almost like government puts them in a position to do that. So I think that's where we've got to have more conversations on. That's where small municipalities have to be a part of that bigger conversation. Because when they decided that, P&M essentially is the big giant. They say, yeah, we can do it. Well, now all of your rural electric co-ops around the state are saying, we can't do this. I don't know where we're going to get this energy from. And so while it might work out for P&M at the end of the day, it may not work out for our companies. And you may see a rural electric co-op selling off or being bought out, and that's when you end up seeing these bigger companies come along. P&M now starts buying everybody up because they can afford to. And then you get these monopolies. That's literally what's happening in California.
Yeah, and the last comment I have to make is when we did a study of our electric rates here, this was our commission, and we have three sources, main sources, and the least expensive was WAPA, which is water. The most expensive was solar. And the solar got so expensive because there were so many perks by the government that it made it worthwhile for people to put that investment in, knowing that they were going to get monies back. And I feel that the government has been a little remiss also in trying to support this issue.
I agree. I think that, and I'll tell you, so we have some members that are solar companies, and they're at the point where they're saying, you know what, we see some of these companies who are really what we would consider bad actors, but because of all of the subsidies that are out there, they're getting bailed out essentially. And so they stay in business and they continue to take advantage. I mean, we've seen that happen here in New Mexico, where people were thinking they were getting solar panels put on their roof that were going to belong to them, and then when they went to sell their home, they find out those don't belong to us, and we don't have any access, we won't have any, we can't do anything with them. And so I think that creates problems, and so I think we need to make sure that we're having those conversations. We got to really try to look at this industry, because it's one that's going to take off. Solar is really going to take off. People see it now. It's not nearly as big as it's going to get, but we've got to make sure that we're not helping the bad actors, and that we're allowing the market to kind of do what it needs to do so that those companies can come along. Because you're right, the subsidies, it kind of screws things up. You don't know who really the good companies are out there. They're getting all of the subsidies, and meanwhile, someone who's actually looking out for their community and trying to get off the ground, they can't get any help. So it's
the municipalities.
Yeah.
We are not qualified to get any of that.
Yep.
And it just really is disappointing.
Yep.
Mayor, thank you for letting me make these comments.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Do we have any further
Just
questions?
one, I want to thank you for a beautiful, balanced view
Thank you.
of the energy situation. I think a lot of us, we all have our own personal views and everything, and if everything they say is making you feel good, there's probably a problem there. I know there are a number of times in your presentation where I kind of, I felt a little uncomfortable with it because it kind of goes against what I feel, but that's the key to a balanced view.
Yes, sir.
Because it's going to rub everybody the wrong way in one way or another.
Yes, sir.
And like you said, it's what's practical and economical, not necessarily your ideal goal,
Yeah.
but you just, you just can't shut off everything bad and go to renewables. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Got to do transition.
I am very glad to see that there is such a large group of people looking at this issue in a realistic manner.
Yes, sir.
And I thank you and your organization for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, I think I'll tell you, so we actually did a presentation for the Rotary Club here in TRC, and I was talking about solar energy, and I was making the point that solar just isn't where it needs to be yet. And I had a member come to me afterwards and say, I felt like your comments were somewhat negative, and so it really got me thinking, because I don't want my presentation to sound that way. The reality of it is that we've been very blessed in New Mexico with tons of natural resources. You know, being an elected official, before I was an elected official, I was very idealistic. I had an idea of the way the world should work, and I wanted to see it work that way. But when I got into office, I realized, you know, these things have to work for citizens, that I'm not here to push my ideals. It needs to work practically. And so, to your point, I think that that's the balancing act that we have to do as elected officials, is we have to remind ourselves we can't be so idealistic. We have to make sure that this is going to work for our citizenry. And as you said, as we work towards that transition, that's a good thing. It's a good thing if we can eliminate carbon in our atmosphere, but we don't want to do it on the backs of the poorest of our citizens. And so I appreciate that, and I hope that that's what my presentation came across. Those comments that I got from that one citizen when I did that presentation a couple months back, they really stuck with me, because I want people to understand that we have the natural resources here to do so much, but we've got to be part of that conversation. And I feel like if you look at the national level and everything that's going on, people have learned to just yell at each other and hate each other rather than to sit down. And that's the beauty of democracy. That's the beauty of it, is the compromise, sitting there, banging it out, figuring out what works best for your people. Because every application doesn't work. Navajo Nation's looking at putting more solar panels on the nation. Why? Because they don't have the infrastructure. Solar is going to be the best application for them. But for the areas where they can put natural gas and help some of their citizens, they got to look at that too. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Do I have any further questions? Commissioner Heschler, nothing? Commissioner Baca? Mr. Gonzalez, again, thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
And if we have any questions, we will be in touch.
Perfect. And just one thing I wanted to point out, I spoke with Renee. We're looking at trying to host an event down here in maybe a couple weeks or in a month, but we really want to continue this conversation. I think, and this is just, you know, this is again me being idealistic now, I want our citizens to be engaged. As I travel the state, I learned that so many of our citizens are so busy grinding every day that they don't have the opportunity to really understand the issues that impact them. And so it has been my goal when we took this on to really do a good job, do something for them that helps educate them on an issue that maybe they weren't familiar with before. So even if they're not familiar with all the other issues they're voting on when it comes to a candidate, that they at least know the facts when it comes to this issue and how it affects New Mexicans. So we'll be looking to do that. We would love to have y'all participate in that. I'll work with Ms. Canton to get that information to y'all, but we want to continue this conversation. It's not ever going to change, and we are better served if our citizens are up to speed with everything going on. And so we look forward to having more of those conversations in your community. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. We hope to see you soon. Okay, the next item on our agenda this morning is item D, the consent calendar. We have D1, City Commission regular minutes of October 9th, 2019, and D2, acknowledge Recreation Advisory Board minutes for August 5th, 2019, and September 9th, 2019. Do I have a motion to approve?
Madam Mayor, I move to approve the consent calendar as you stated.
Thank you.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to approve this consent calendar as noted. Is there any further questions, comments, concerns? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. The next item on our agenda this morning is item E, ordinances, resolutions, and zoning. E1, discussion action, resolution number 1719/20, declaring surplus property to be sold. Clerk Canton.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Commissioners, Acting City Manager. This resolution, as you are very used to, is declaring another list for surplus property. And as you can see on the attachment is the majority of these are equipment, vehicles. We have pressure washers, and what we'd like to do, just to see the difference and the possibility for additional revenue, which is a good thing as well, to maybe split it up and do part of it on a public auction with publicsurplus.com. And I had worked previously last year, setting all of that up. So it's kind of in place. We'll have to take pictures. And we still need to do the Kelly Blue Book review for each of the items. And other than that, we're asking for your permission to proceed.
Thank you, Clerk Canton. Attorney Rubin, do you have any questions, comments, concerns regarding this?
Yeah, actually, just a couple of things I was looking at. So I'm looking at the attachment, and I know you and I didn't get a chance to talk about this today, but I do see that the original cost of these items, actually, there was some value at one time. Do we have any idea at this point what we're looking at?
No, but I've got Lisa working on the Kelly Blue Book values,
Okay.
because some of them are so old that, and the purple car, the Ford Taurus that we had in the utility office was in an accident. So, you know, none of them are really worth much. So, I did add in there that the publication's been sent in for once this Friday, once next Friday, so that those items that we decide to put in the local auction, if any, will be covered with the publications.
So, okay, so that's good. We'll have the publication, we're going to do two publications for the auction, and then how about for the other portion you're talking about the website we're going to go to, whatever, are we going to, do they notice about that, or how do we proceed on that?
Yeah, we'll do the same. We'll do the same, you know, that there's surplus property to be disposed of, and give, you know, the details. They have their own publication requirement too.
Okay, so there'll be two separate sets of publication. One, two notices for the public auction, and there'll be a separate set of publications going on for the website.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And just add in a little bit more, you know, the reason that I had been working on this and got both the backing from city managers is that, you know, once in a while, when we had all the law enforcement stuff that we declared surplus and put it in the auction, you know, if it ends up at the end of the auction and you get, you know, the crowd is weared down and they've got a few boxes there, they'll sell all three of those boxes for $5. So, you know, we're not in the money business, but if I'm going to put the work into it and dispose of these, you know, it would help with our revenue.
Commissioner, the reason I was asking these questions is because there were, at least at one point, some pretty good values on these assets. I don't know what they're worth now, but keeping that in mind, that's why I felt the notice requirements are very important to me here tonight. So that's why I asked the
Absolutely.
question. Okay.
Thank you, Attorney Rubin. Do we have any questions from the commission?
Just a comment, Mayor. I think I'm very impressed, Renee, that you're taking another look other than just going to the auction block at the Fair Barn.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that a lot.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Mayor.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns? Hearing none, I will stand for a motion to approve resolution number 1719/20 declaring surplus property to be sold.
Mayor Whitehead, I'll make that motion, but I'd like to add that once the auction is complete or we've disposed of this property, I would like to report back to the commission what the results of that exchange is.
Great
So
idea.
that we understand, because we are dealing with some values of over $100,000 at one time. We know that the equipment isn't worth that now, but I'd like to know what we got for it.
Thank you, thank you. And do I have a second?
I have a second with the stipulation that Commissioner Heschler put on.
Perfect. At this time, I have a motion and a second to approve resolution number 1719/20 declaring surplus property to be sold with the stipulation that after the sale has taken place, that they come back with a report of what the auction did bring in, as some of these items may have had value at one time. Is there any further questions, comments, or concerns? Hearing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call roll?
Honorable Sandra Whitehead,
Yes.
Honorable Kathy Clark,
Aye.
Honorable Ralph Heschler,
Aye.
Honorable Paul Baca,
Aye.
Honorable George Siketi,
Yes.
Motion carries. Thank you all. The next item on our agenda this morning is F, new business. F1, discussion action, approve the Recreation Board recommendation to appoint Ingo Oppenheimer and Jenny Neely to the vacant positions on the board.
Madam Mayor, do you mind if I present from here for this one?
That's perfect, thank you.
It's nice and simple. We have only 2 applicants at this point, and we do have some other boards coming up where an interview process will more than likely be necessary because we have more applicants than we need, which is a good thing. So the Recreation Advisory Board unanimously approved recommending Ingo Heckner and Jenny Neely to the advisory board for a term of 2 years.
Is there any questions, comments, or concerns? Hearing none, I will stand for a motion to approve the recommendation of the Recreation Board appointment.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a motion and 2 seconds to approve the recommendation of the Recreation Board for the appointment of Ingo Oppenheimer and Jenny Neely to the vacant positions on the board. Is there any further questions, comments, or concerns?
Yeah. Commissioner Heschler, how do you pronounce that name now?
I would think that last name is pronounced Hebner.
It's Heckner, yeah.
Heckner.
Mhm.
Oh, well, that wasn't what they told me. So Hefner then.
Hebner. Not you,
Sorry.
Hebner.
Hefner, sorry. Excuse me, apologize. Correction, Hefner. Ingo Hefner. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Thank you. And I apologize for mispronouncing the name. It's Hefner. Okay, the next item on our agenda is G, reports. The first report is city manager, which we do not have a city manager this morning, but we have an acting city manager. Do you have anything to report on?
Not from Mr. Madrid, thank you, but I do want to say it's been a great few months since I've been here, a lot of support, a lot of good in this community, and again, I'm really pleased to be back home.
Thank you, Ms. Carroll. The next one on the reports is our city attorney. Attorney Rubin, do you have a report?
No, I do not, thank you.
Thank you. And commissioners, let's start with Commissioner Baca.
I do not.
Mayor Pro Tem Clark.
No, ma'am.
Commissioner Heschler.
You pronounced that correctly. I have a short report, and that is just basically yesterday I had the privilege of hosting all of our commissions from Sierra County, the Tourism Board, the Chambers of Commerce, along with Spaceport America, Mr. Lopez, in a forum where we discussed how this community or this county can interact with Spaceport America. And thank you folks that were present from this group. The results of that were basically that we have a group that is going to come together and meet. I'll get that organized so that we can interact with Spaceport America and see how that interaction can benefit this community as well as Spaceport America. So I'm looking forward to that opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Zaghetti.
Oh, not this one.
Hey, not this month, not this meeting. Wow, nice. And I do not have a report at this time. So the next item on our agenda this morning is item H, executive session, H1, limited personnel matters, various positions pursuant to 1015-1H2. Do I have a motion to go into executive session? And I hear a second.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to go into executive session. Is there any further questions, comments, concerns? Hearing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call roll?
Honorable Sandra Whitehead.
Yes.
Honorable Kathy Clark.
Aye.
Honorable Ralph Hitchler.
Yes.
Honorable Paul Baca.
Yes.
Honorable George Takei.
Aye.
Motion carries. We will now go into executive session as soon as the room clears. And again, I apologize. Yes, 1 minute. I knew I was going to do that.